When Shannon, best known for his hit Runaway, died in 1990, his home in Santa Clarita, California, was left behind, a quiet suburban property surrounded by orange trees and thick hedges. The stucco walls were sun-bleached, and the Spanish-tiled roof gave it an almost timeless look. Over the years, the house passed through different hands, but it was never a place people stayed for long. Neighbors whispered that the house carried a heaviness with it, a silence that went deeper than just age. In 2021, a married couple, Eric and Melissa Turner, bought the property. They were in their late 30s, originally from Colorado, and had saved for years to buy their dream California home. Melissa was drawn to the history of the place, charmed by the idea that it had once belonged to a music legend. Eric was more practical. He liked that the price was lower than most houses in the neighborhood, and he chalked that up to nothing more than age and location. First, everything seemed normal. The Turners loved the arched doorways, the old wooden beams across the ceiling, and the music room at the back of the house where Shannon had once written songs. Melissa turned that room into her art studio, while Eric set up his office upstairs. But within a few weeks, small things began to bother them. Melissa claimed she would hear music late at night, soft, muffled, like an old radio playing somewhere in the house. The sound always came from the music room, even though the stereo they had placed there was unplugged. Eric brushed it off, saying she was probably hearing neighbors or imagining things, but Melissa insisted it wasn't coming from outside. Then came the smell of cigarette smoke. Neither of them smoked, but certain parts of the house, mostly the hallway near the music room, would suddenly fill with the sharp, stale scent, as if someone had just exhaled behind them. The most unsettling experience happened one evening when Eric was alone. Melissa was away visiting family, and he stayed up late working. Around 1 a.m., he walked downstairs to grab a glass of water. Passing by the music room, he noticed the door was slightly open. He knew he had closed it earlier, but he stepped closer anyway. Inside, he swore he saw a shadow, tall, hunched, sitting at the piano bench. The outline was vague, but it shifted, like someone leaning forward to place their hands on the keys. Then came a sound so faint he almost doubted it. The first notes of Runaway, played unevenly, like a hand brushing against keys. Eric slammed the door and didn't open it again until morning. After that, both of them started noticing cold spots, flickering lights, and the feeling of being watched, especially in the evenings. Friends who visited commented on the heavy atmosphere, some even saying they felt sad as soon as they walked inside. Melissa, fascinated but increasingly disturbed, began researching Shannon's final years. She learned that he had struggled with depression, that he had died in that very house, and that many fans believed his spirit lingered because of the music he never got to finish. The Turners tried to live with it, convincing themselves they could handle the strange occurrences. But after one final incident, they couldn't ignore it anymore. One night, while Eric and Melissa were asleep, they were woken by the unmistakable sound of a man singing. Not just a hum or a whisper singing. The voice carried through the hallway, low and haunting, repeating a line over and over. Eric grabbed a flashlight and rushed downstairs, but when he entered the music room, it went silent. The piano lid was open, though neither of them had touched it in weeks. Melissa broke down in tears, convinced they weren't wanted in the house. Within 3 months, they had put the property back on the market. Neighbors weren't surprised. They had seen owners come and go before. To this day, the house sits quietly, often empty for long stretches. People who pass by say that, on certain nights, if you stop and listen carefully near the hedges, you can still hear faint music drifting from the windows like an old radio playing a half-forgotten song. Eric and Melissa Turner didn't tell anyone what had happened that night, the night they both heard the singing. They packed the memory away in silence, almost as though speaking of it out loud would give it more weight, more power. But silence doesn't erase fear. In fact, in that house, silence seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. The rooms were beautiful in the daylight. Melissa would open the curtains in the living room, and the whole house would flood with sun. The terracotta tiles in the hallway glowed a soft orange. The white plaster walls seemed almost warm, and the garden outside was alive with birds darting through the orange trees. On those mornings, She would almost convince herself that nothing was wrong, that the house was just old, with creaks and drafts and quirks, and that maybe, in time, they would laugh about the strange weeks when they thought it was haunted. But by evening, the atmosphere changed. The sunlight would slip away, shadows would lengthen, and the house would settle into its other personality, darker, colder, more watchful. The rooms that felt open and inviting by day became unnervingly still at night, as though every corner held someone waiting unseen. The Turners often found excuses not to go into certain rooms after sundown. The music room especially seemed to draw in the night air, its doorway blacker than the others, the air around it colder. Melissa kept her art supplies there, but she noticed she was spending less and less time in the studio. When she did sit down to paint, she found it hard to concentrate. It wasn't the silence, it was the opposite. She had the constant sensation of sound just beyond her hearing, a low hum, as though someone were talking faintly in another room. At first she thought it might be Eric upstairs on a phone call, but more than once she checked and found him fast asleep. Sometimes she would pause, brush in hand, and swear that she could hear footsteps behind her. She never turned around quickly enough to see anything, but the feeling of being watched was so strong that she often abandoned her canvas and left the room altogether. Eric, on the other hand, had begun to grow restless in his office. He was a practical man, not one to scare easily, but he had started locking the music room door at night. It gave him a sense of control, a way to keep whatever was inside contained. But the more he tried to control it, the more the house seemed to push back. He noticed things were subtly out of place. His computer mouse on the wrong side of the desk, papers turned upside down, pens scattered when he knew he had left them neatly aligned. One night he returned from the kitchen and found every drawer of his desk pulled open at once, as though someone had rifled through them. The most disturbing moments were the sounds. Some nights it was faint piano notes, uneven and hesitant, drifting up through the floorboards. Other nights it was whistling, a sharp, tuneless whistle that seemed to travel from room to room, just out of reach. Once, as Eric lay in bed beside Melissa, he heard what he could only describe as a sigh, deep, heavy, tired, coming from the foot of their bed. He sat up instantly, heart pounding, but saw nothing in the dark except the vague outline of the dresser. The couple began avoiding conversations about the house altogether. They both felt the strain of unspoken fear, like a wall between them, but neither wanted to admit how far it had gone. They told friends back home that everything was fine, that California life was exactly what they had dreamed of. But when friends suggested visiting, Melissa quickly made excuses. She didn't want anyone else to experience the house, didn't want to see the look in someone else's eyes if they felt it too. One late afternoon in November, Melissa decided she couldn't keep ignoring her art studio. She carried her paints into the music room and sat down at the easel. The light was fading, but she told herself it was just another room, just a space, and she needed to reclaim it. For nearly an hour she managed to work, the rhythmic strokes of her brush calming her nerves. But then she realized she had been painting without any background noise, no radio, no music. The silence pressed in on her ears until it felt like a weight. Slowly, almost against her will, she turned her head toward the piano. The lid was open. She was sure it had been shut when she came in. Melissa froze, brush dripping onto the canvas. She stared at the black and white keys, waiting, dreading. For a long moment nothing happened, and she almost convinced herself it was her imagination. Then, softly, a single key pressed down with a dull thud. The note was low, drawn out, almost mournful. Melissa stumbled back, knocking over her chair. The piano fell silent, but she was already out the door, slamming it behind her. That night, Eric found her sitting in the kitchen with every light on in the house. She didn't tell him what happened, she didn't need to. He saw it in her face. From then on, neither of them set foot in the music room after sunset. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The nights were the worst. Eric and Melissa began to dread the fall of dusk. It wasn't just the darkness outside. It was the way the house itself seemed to change once the last strips of sunlight disappeared behind the hills. The air grew cooler, heavier, and every sound, the ticking of the old clock in the hallway, The creak of wooden beams as the structure settled became sharper, more alive, as though the house was listening back. Melissa started sleeping with the bedside lamp on. At first, Eric protested he preferred a dark room, but soon he stopped objecting. The soft glow from the lamp was the only thing that gave them a sense of protection, though it didn't truly help. Several times, Melissa woke in the middle of the night to find Eric sitting upright, staring toward the doorway, his face pale and tense. When she asked what was wrong, he would only shake his head, muttering, "I thought I heard something." Neither of them dared to admit how little they were sleeping. By December, they were avoiding entire sections of the house. The music room was shut tight at all times, and they rarely went upstairs after dark. Instead, they confined themselves to the living room and kitchen, as though keeping to smaller spaces made them safer. Melissa would curl up on the couch, pretending to read, while Eric busied himself with chores he didn't really need to do, wiping down counters that were already clean, rearranging tools in the garage. But no matter how they filled their time, the feeling of being watched lingered. One evening, Eric tried to distract them both by cooking a late dinner. He opened a bottle of wine, put on music through his phone, and attempted to carry on as if everything was normal. The atmosphere loosened for a short while they even laughed together at a story from Melissa's childhood. But then, just as Eric set a plate of food on the table, the music cut out. The phone lay on the counter, its screen black, though the battery had been full. A second later, from the hallway, came the faint crackle of a radio tuning in. It was the same sound Melissa had heard before, that muffled distortion of static and old broadcast frequencies, like a voice struggling to come through. Eric set the plate down and walked slowly toward the hall. Melissa followed, clutching his arm. The sound grew louder as they neared the music room. The door was still shut, but the noise static, followed by a faint guitar note, was clearly coming from inside. For a moment, they both stood frozen, neither daring to move closer. Then the sound stopped, cut off so abruptly that the silence afterward seemed deafening. Eric's hand trembled on the doorknob, but he didn't open it. Instead, he stepped back, muttering, "No, not tonight." They retreated to the kitchen, leaving the light on in the hall, but neither of them touched their food. The next day, Melissa insisted on inviting a neighbor over. She told Eric she needed to prove to herself that outsiders could feel what they felt, that it wasn't just in their heads. Their neighbor, an older woman named Diane, agreed to come by for coffee. Diane had lived down the street for more than 20 years. She knew the house well, knew whose it had been before. When she stepped inside, Melissa watched her carefully for a reaction. At first, Diane smiled politely and complimented the arched ceilings, the tiled floor. But as she moved deeper into the house, her face changed. Her steps slowed, her eyes darted toward the hallway. Finally, she set her coffee cup down, untouched, and said in a low voice, "This house has never been right. People don't stay here. They think they can, but they don't. I don't mean to frighten you, but you should know, it has a reputation." Eric asked sharply, "What reputation?" Diane hesitated, then glanced toward the music room door. "It's always been that room. Everyone who's lived here, they complain about the same thing. Sounds at night. Music when there shouldn't be. A feeling you're not alone. I'm surprised you've lasted this long." Melissa felt her stomach turn. Diane didn't stay much longer, and when she left, she avoided looking back at the house. That night, Melissa dreamed of a man sitting at the piano. His back was to her, shoulders hunched, his head bowed as though in pain. She couldn't see his face, but she recognized the outline from photographs she had looked up of Shannon. In the dream, his hands rested on the keys, but he didn't play. Instead, he turned slowly, and though his features were blurred, his mouth opened as if to sing. Melissa woke gasping, her throat tight with panic, and refused to sleep again until dawn. Over the following weeks, the boundaries of the haunting seemed to widen. It was no longer confined to the music room. Melissa found her paintings altered brushstrokes she swore she hadn't made, strange shadowed shapes appearing in the background of her work. Eric began hearing tapping sounds in the walls of his office, rhythmic, almost like fingers drumming against plaster. Sometimes the tapping would follow him as he walked from one room to another. The couple rarely spoke about leaving, though the thought weighed constantly on both of them. Instead, they carried the fear silently, each waiting for the other to break first. But the house had its own way of pushing them. One night, long after midnight, Melissa woke to the sound of the piano playing not just a single key, but a full, halting melody. The notes were shaky, uneven, but unmistakable. She shook Eric awake, and together they listened as the music drifted up from downstairs. It played for nearly a minute before stopping suddenly, leaving the air ringing with silence. When Eric finally worked up the courage to go downstairs, the music room door was wide open. Eric stood in the hallway, staring at the open music room door. The sight unsettled him more than the sound itself, the fact that the door, which they had locked every night for weeks, now stood ajar as though it had been waiting for him. Melissa clutched his arm, whispering for him not to go inside, but Eric felt something deeper than fear. A sense of intrusion, as though the house itself were testing his resolve. He stepped inside. The room was cold, much colder than the rest of the house. The curtains swayed faintly, though the windows were closed. The piano lid was open, its black and white keys gleaming under the dim light. Eric approached slowly, Melissa hovering at the doorway. His reflection stared back at him from the polished wood, pale and distorted. For a moment, everything was still. Then, just as he reached for the lid, a sound broke the silence. A single note, struck hard, resonating through the room. Neither of them had touched the keys. Melissa gasped, and Eric slammed the lid shut with a force that echoed through the house. He locked the door and pulled her away, but the damage was done. That night, the house no longer felt like it merely contained something. It felt alive and angry. From that point on, the disturbances escalated. Doors would open and shut on their own, sometimes violently. Lights flickered even after electricians inspected the wiring and found nothing wrong. Objects shifted across rooms, a vase moving inches overnight, chairs turning slightly, as though unseen guests had sat there in the dark. The smell of cigarette smoke became constant in the hallway, thick and acrid, lingering long after windows had been thrown open. Sometimes, Melissa swore she saw faint wisps of smoke curling in the air, even though the house was empty. But the most unnerving experiences were auditory. The radio static returned, louder now, filling the house at odd hours. Sometimes it carried snippets of music, old songs Melissa recognized faintly but couldn't place. Other times, it was a voice, low, distant, singing only fragments of words. Once, in the middle of the night, Eric awoke to the sound of the voice whispering directly in his ear. He bolted upright, heart racing, but the room was empty. Melissa stirred beside him, her expression haunted. "I heard it too," she whispered. "They tried to fight it." Melissa burned sage, following advice from friends. Eric brought in a priest to bless the house. For a few days, the atmosphere lightened, but it never lasted. The house always seemed to return to its old heaviness, as though whatever lingered within its walls could not be pushed out so easily. The breaking point came in late January. Melissa had been painting in the living room, trying to distract herself, when she noticed something strange on the canvas. She had been working on a landscape, but across the surface of the painting a new form had appeared, dark, shadowed, almost like a figure standing in the distance. She hadn't painted it. The brushstrokes were unfamiliar, rough, almost frantic, as though someone else had held her hand while she worked. Her stomach turned cold as she realized the figure's outline resembled a man seated at a piano. She screamed, dropping the brush, and Eric rushed in. When he saw the canvas, his face hardened. Without a word, he grabbed it, carried it outside, and burned it in the fire pit. The flames twisted and spat, the paint bubbling as though resisting. Melissa stood shivering beside him, clutching her arms. That night, they packed their bags. They didn't wait to sell the house properly. They abandoned furniture, clothing, even boxes of personal belongings. By dawn, they were gone, driving away in silence, their car heavy with the few things they had dared to take. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, unsurprised. They had seen families come and go before, each leaving with the same weary, haunted expressions. The Turners never spoke publicly about what drove them out, though Melissa confided to a close friend that she still woke sometimes to the sound of piano notes, faint and distant, even in their new home. The house itself still stands, quiet and outwardly beautiful, its Spanish-tiled roof gleaming in the sun, its garden overgrown but fragrant with orange blossoms. Realtors try to sell it from time to time, always emphasizing its history, its charm, its connection to a music legend. But buyers never stay long. Neighbors claim that on certain nights, when the streets are empty and the air is still, music drifts from the windows, old songs carried faintly on the breeze, broken by bursts of static. And if you stand close enough, near the hedges at the edge of the yard, you might even hear a man's voice, low and weary, repeating the same unfinished line over and over, as though forever searching for a song that will never be complete. The house waits, as it always has, for its next owners. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.